Thank you for joining us. My name is Barry Erickson, and I'm Community Engagement Coordinator at Wheaton Public Library. Tonight, we are delighted to bring you this presentation on the perils of bird migration with DuPage Birding Club founding member and former president, Denis Kania. Founded in 1985, the DuPage Birding Club is one of the largest and most active birding groups in Illinois. Their mission is to promote birding among over 400 members, as well as the general public, through field experiences and education. Birders of all skill and interest levels are welcome. Denis has been birding for over 35 years, combining his interest in birding with art and photography. He spends much of his time locally, monitoring birds at Fermilab and teaching at the Morton Arboretum. But at every opportunity, Denis travels to the far corners of the world in pursuit of birds he has not yet seen. So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to you, Denis. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thanks a lot, Barry. Glad to be here. And this is a perfectly timed presentation. The migration of our songbirds is well underway right now. And every day that I go out, I'm seeing new arrivals. So it's a very exciting time. And I hope that your birding will extend beyond this program tonight, and you'll go out and see some of these great birds that are moving through the county right now. So we're going to talk about bird migration, and these are some of the topics that I want to make sure that we cover tonight. So we're going to talk about the benefits and hazards of migration, and we'll talk about migration strategies by family, benefits of nocturnal migration, major flyways, the broad front migration, natural obstacles, both geographical and meteorological, and hormonal changes and fat storage. Timing of migration and the energy equation. And then after that point, we're going to go into some of the things that we can probably do in our own backyards to help these birds as they migrate. Because as we talk, you'll come to understand just how critical even our own backyards can be to their survival. So the first thing we want to talk about are those benefits and hazards of migration. And usually I like my program to be very interactive, so I give people an opportunity to list out the benefits, and then we list out those hazards, but we can't do that tonight. So I've saved you a lot of trouble, and I have them listed out. So some of the benefits are avoidance of competition for breeding territories with resident species on their wintering grounds. So a lot of these birds, their true home is really in South and Central America, and if they just stayed there, they would have to compete with a lot of other species. The biodiversity down there is very extensive. There's many, many more species. So over time, they evolved to have this strategy of moving northward into open areas and finding new places to breed. And so that has caused the migration all the way up into North America. When these birds do migrate up into the northern latitudes, they do have longer daylight hours. So any of you that have been in Alaska know that in the middle of summer, you never see the sun go down. It does at some point, or becomes very close to doing that, but we actually never see it because we're usually fast asleep. But there are many, many hours of daylight up there. And what that means is that there's more time for them to stuff food into the mouths of their little babies. So that's very important. So they can actually raise more than one brood per year. There's also a concentrated source of food if they undertake these long migrations, because when they go up to the northern latitudes, like even here, when we go out in the summertime, we see many, many insects. And the life cycle of all those insects have to be compressed into a very small period of time compared to further south, because they can't survive in the cold temperatures. So everything's happening in a much smaller window. And if they partake in that, they're going to see a lot more insects. So people often ask if I go down to South America, they wonder just how bad the bugs are down there. My backyard in July is probably the buggiest place that I've ever traveled to. So it does make a huge difference up at the northern latitudes as far as all the concentration of insects and all those different food sources. So some of the hazards for migration would include changing weather conditions. Once a bird launches off on one of its legs of its journey, it really doesn't know what it's going to encounter. And so weather conditions can change rapidly, and that will definitely have an impact on the success of that migration. They may cause the bird to divert to a different location than they had intended, or they may have to terminate that leg of their journey and wait for better conditions. So if they do that, they may end up in a inhospitable place where there's no guarantee of food or shelter. So in the spring migration, I'd say about 3 or 4 years ago, we had a huge drought going on in Texas. And so there were vast areas that would not have supported many of our songbirds as they migrated through, because it was so dry, there weren't a lot of insects, there weren't plants growing at that time. And so obviously, in order to make that migration, they would have to alter their route, or they have to run the risk of going through an area where they're not going to be able to recharge. And I'll talk a little bit later about how important it is for them to recharge their fat storage. And there's a lack of experience for first-time migrants when they're either heading south or even heading north. If they haven't made that trip before, they're going to run into some obstacles that they don't understand. And there's also a lack of experience with new predators. So if they are down in South America or Central America, they're used to the predators that are down there. But once they come up here or in transit, they're going to run into predators that they're not used to. So there are various migration practices, or sometimes I say strategies by family. And so I'll give you some examples here. Sandhill cranes and large raptors, due to their weight, they rely heavily on thermals on sunny days in order to complete their migration. I'm sure all of you at some point in time have heard sandhill cranes as they're croaking way up in the air. And you'll look up and you'll see these birds and they disappear and then they appear again. They're actually circling up above us. And depending on the angle of their body, they will reveal themselves, or sometimes they're just very hard to see. So what they're doing when they're doing that circling is they're actually rising on a thermal. And so they're gaining altitude. And at some point, they are going to spill out of that thermal and head towards the next thermal. And they can obviously see where the next thermal is, once they're way up high. But as they're moving to that next thermal, they're actually not flapping their wings at all. They're just gliding. They're gliding along. Just like when they were soaring, they weren't flapping their wings. They just kind of were circling and letting the air raise them up. And now they start to lose altitude as they're drifting out of that thermal and heading towards the next one. But what they do is they then make contact with that next thermal and they allow it to lift it back up again. And they'll continue doing that all day long. And certainly they're capable of flapping their wings, and in certain conditions, they end up having to use up a lot of energy and flap in order to get from point A to point B. But in taking this approach, they're saving a ton of energy. And so like I said, most of our larger birds take advantage of that. Sandhill cranes would be an example. And again, large raptors would also be doing that. So another example of a migration practice would be, many times we see waterfowl flying in a formation, and they're flying in that V formation, and they're actually drafting on the birds ahead of them. And so that's another strategy so that they save energy. You have to keep in mind that they're moving great distances all in one day, sometimes hundreds of miles. And so every little bit of energy that they can save in making that particular leg of their journey, they're going to save a lot of energy. So that's all very important. And then the majority of our passerines, which are our perching birds, and I have many examples here to show you that those could be warblers or thrushes or tanagers or buntings or sparrows. They will migrate during night under the cover of darkness. And that's a huge advantage. And there are many reasons that's a successful strategy. And so here are some of those benefits of nocturnal migration. So the atmosphere is less turbulent once the sun goes down. Remember, I talked about those thermals, and so that is creating uneven patterns in the atmosphere above us. But as the Earth cools down, that's when the air is less turbulent, and quite often, I'm sure when we watch the weather reports, we see that the winds are dying down in the evening quite often, or the threat of some of our more severe weather starts to die down once the sun isn't producing all that energy that stimulates all those severe weather events. So having that less turbulent air is a very important thing. And also they have cooler temperatures in the evening or at night. And, think about you are wanting to exercise at the gym. Do you want to be in a hot gym room or do you want to be in a cooler one? So certainly we perform a lot better when we're in cooler temperatures. And that's the same case for those birds. And you have to remember that they're flying these long distances and pumping those little wings for quite a long time, nonstop. They don't just, come down, take a break, and then lift off again. Once they have that initial lift off in the evening, they keep on going until they make their landfall wherever down the way. So they're less likely to encounter predators as well when they migrate at night. They are migrating at altitudes that are high enough that they're not going to encounter very many predators, certainly not owls or other night predators. By migrating at night, it allows birds to have an opportunity to forage for food during daylight hours. So think about that for just a minute. If they were foraging, having to forage at night because they flew all day long, they're going to not be very successful at finding any kind of food. So what flying at night allows them is they come down early in the morning from their flight and they now immediately start foraging for food. And you can tell which birds have actually moved that previous night. If you're a birder and you go out looking around, you'll see how these warblers and other small birds are just frantically moving around, chasing. And we always talk about how fast these birds are moving through the canopy of the trees. It's because they're looking very aggressively for anything to eat. And you'll notice that as the day wears on, if you get into the latter part of the morning, all of a sudden it seems like the birds are not moving around as quickly, and that's because they have successfully refueled for the most part, and it's not as critical at that point. So they do start to slow down. And it's been proven through many different studies that our birds actually navigate through celestial landmarks, and so they are using points of light in the night sky as a directional tool. So I'd like to talk a little bit about our North American flyways. And you can see that we have an Atlantic flyway and a Mississippi flyway, Central flyway, and Pacific flyway. And they're all different kind of color codes here to kind of help you to separate those visually. And in many books, when we see a map like this, what this says to me, or how I interpret this map, it looks like there's on and off ramps, and there's certain areas that these birds are migrating through. So when we talk about the Mississippi flyway, I always remember as a young person thinking about that these birds actually kind of worked their way towards the Mississippi River Valley, and that's where all the migration took place. And so they would just streamline through there. And that's not quite the case. I mean, we certainly have birds that will choose a certain region of the country that they move through. Some species have migrational patterns that they'll use one route in the springtime. Some of our shorebirds are like that, and they'll come up through the central United States in the springtime, but then in the fall, they're actually coming down more towards the Atlantic flyway. And so we're not as likely to see those birds a second time in the Mississippi flyway. So there are some strategies on how they move around, and they may not use certain regions of the country, either going north or south. But the fact of the matter is that these birds are actually moving on a broad front migration. And this is just one example to show you just how many birds are moving through. This is my son here. He was participating as a volunteer with some research going on up in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. And so he was at the Linwood Springs Research Station, where every night in the fall they would band saw-whet owls. And the way that they do this is they would actually set up a series of mist nets, which are these little fine nets that birds get trapped in when they fly into them. And they will set those up in an octagon form, and then they put a sounding device in the center of all of that. And it's playing the sound of the saw-whet owl. And so as these birds are migrating through, they're curious, and they come in to investigate the fact that they're hearing the saw-whet owl, and they fly into one of the nets. So they'll actually capture these birds. They take a lot of scientific data off of them at that point in time, and then they ban the birds, and then they release the birds. So there was one event, and my son wasn't there that night, but during the season that he was participating in this, there was one night that they were banding saw-whet owls, and they actually captured 70 of these saw-whet owls in a single night. Well, I will not see 70 saw-whet owls in my entire life, I'm quite sure. Based on the last 35 years, I probably have seen easily less than 35 saw-whet owls. So the chances of running into 70 owls is quite incredible. And now if you think about the fact that if this whole screen were the state of Wisconsin, the whole screen you're looking at right now, the area of influence by this researcher playing these tapes and bringing in owls is probably, again, if this is the entire state, the letter I right here in Linwood is about the area that he's influencing. So when you think about the fact that he has 70 saw-whet owls migrating through that small area, think about what's happening across the entire state and think about what's happening across the entire Midwest. So these birds are in actuality migrating on a broad front, and if they weren't, then we wouldn't be seeing all these birds most likely in DuPage County. And just one little statistic that I'll throw in at this point is that if you look at a checklist for the birds of DuPage County, there's actually 268 species that show up in the county. So that's quite a long list for all of us avid birders to go and chase on a regular basis. So it's hard for us to maybe understand the concept of migration, although we can witness it. And when we do witness a migration, it's because it's happening in the daylight. And so we call that a diurnal migration. And we do have things that make those kinds of migrations. Certainly our waterfowl would be an example, because we all have seen Canada geese flying in a V formation. We've all seen those sandhill cranes going over. And those are a couple of examples of large birds that are moving through and quite conspicuous. And sometimes smaller birds will gather into large flocks. A lot of our blackbirds will do that. And we'll actually see a big swarm of birds like this moving across the landscape. And so those are birds that have gathered together. They're very gregarious in the fall season, and they are actually making large movements and easily to record them because they do almost black out the sky. I can't even imagine what it was like in the old days when before we had our huge imprint on the continent. Spectacles like this would probably be a small band of birds. I'm sure that the masses of birds were just hard to even imagine. Another passage that we possibly will encounter or make note of. I do remember this as a child growing up in Chicago. I would look up in the evening sky and I would see all these little birds darting around on real long pointed wings with these little white bands on towards the tip of the wings. And those were common nighthawks. And that was a very, very common sight when I was growing up. Now we've lost many of these birds, and so it's not as commonly seen. However, it is something that is still observable. And I do recall just a couple of autumns ago, we were in Lisle, Illinois, watching the evening sky as we were having dinner. And it was an outdoor dining experience. And all of a sudden, nighthawks started showing up, and the sky was full of them. I mean, you couldn't look up and not see several nighthawks at one time. So I'm sure some of you have noticed that or encountered that during your lifetime. And they are making a very, very long migration. So these are birds that they do barely nest in our region, but most of the nesting is occurring north of us in North America. But they do make various passages to get down to South America. And so some of them are using the land bridge through Mexico. Some of them are going across the Gulf, leaving the southern states here and then making landfall on the Yucatan. Or some of them are actually island hopping their way through the Caribbean. But in any case, they all managed to get down here to South America, and they're going as far south as Argentina. So you can see that the range map goes all the way down to here. So it's pretty incredible, the migration that they're taking. As they do migrate, and the reason we see them in the evening all scurrying around in the sky is they're actually feeding on the wing, and they're eating insects as they go. And so they'll continue to eat as long as they can find insects during the night while they're making that migration. And their migrations usually precede a cool front in the fall. So if we know that a cold front is coming, that's a good time in September to look towards the night skies and see nighthawks moving above us. So here's a little, this is a species that kind of gives us a little bit of a problem in understanding migration, because we talk about, quite often you watch the news and one of our weathermen will say, oh, well, I just had a report that someone saw the first robin of spring. And so people think that for the most part, and robins are disappearing and we don't have them on the landscape in the middle of winter. So we look forward to seeing them coming north and migrating in the spring. But the actual case is that we do have robins here all year round. So the puzzlement is, are these birds that actually bred in our backyards and they've now stayed for the winter, or what's going on? And so most likely it's our birds are probably moving out, and birds from a little further north are moving on down here. But the name of the game for all of our breeding species in North America is trying to get back to these breeding territories as soon as they can in the springtime. So the males are not going to migrate any further than they absolutely have to. And so it's kind of a roll of the dice. If they pick an area, whether or not there's going to be a suitable amount of food source for them to make it through the winter. And they do change their diet from eating insects and worms to eating fruit in the winter time. So if you have a lot of fruit trees around, or in some of our river valleys, which have a lot of fruiting trees in them, some of them not always necessarily native trees, but things like buckthorn and even honeysuckle, they are providing a lot of fruit. And so these American robins are going to make a meal out of those all winter long. The females, on the other hand, since they require more energy during the course of the year for egg production and so forth in raising their young, they need to make sure that they recharge better. So they are more likely to move further south. And so the birds that are sticking around by us in the wintertime are probably, I would think they're mostly males. But at the first opportunity, all these birds are going to be starting to move back to their territories. And the males that stayed, as close as possible to their breeding territories are going to be the first ones back if they survive the winter. And so then they get the choice of territories. So that's kind of their strategy. And I think I mentioned all that. So the American robin's migration is driven by food rather than by temperature. And when birds do return to spring, that leading edge of their migration is formed by a 36-degree isotherm. So where things are warming up enough that we're consistently up to that 36-degree range, that's really the boundary of how far robins are going to be migrating north. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that get in the way of migration. And North America is really suited quite well to a north-south migrational route. Our mountain ranges are all oriented to run north and south. All of our major rivers are oriented to run north and south. And so this gives the birds some really nice corridors to move through. Obviously, there are some obstacles in their way. There are some mountains that would intercept some of the valleys, and so that creates maybe a little bit of a hardship for some of our birds. They also don't like to fly over large bodies of water. So the Great Lakes end up being a problem for some of our birds, and I've witnessed that on a regular basis. I go to Ohio almost every spring, and we set ourselves up on the south shores of Lake Erie. And if the weather conditions are not really appropriate for crossing a large body of water, all those little warblers and thrushes and vireos are all going to stack up on the south edge of Lake Erie and just kind of hang around in the woods that are along the lakefront, managing to refuel and just kind of biding their time, waiting for the best conditions so that they can fly across this large body of water. Well, birders have certainly figured that out. And so as much as birds are migrating, so are birders. And I can go to this place in Ohio and see license plates from just about every state in the United States. And I've seen people there that have come all the way from Africa, from South America, from Europe. So from all over the world, people come because they know about all of these warblers and thrushes and vireos all hanging out, waiting for that opportunity. So it is a huge obstacle for them to go across open water. And the reason for that is, if conditions change, there's no place for them to land, obviously. So, but they're very fearful of having to do that. And I will have a remarkable story to share in just a little bit about birds that will go out over the water. But before we get to that, I also want to talk, one of the other natural obstacles would be our weather patterns. And so optimum weather conditions for migration, if we can use this example here out on this weather map, if we were to position this high and this low just a little further to the east so that it corresponds to Illinois. I should probably find a better map someday that does that. But the highs and lows, the circular motion around a low is in a clockwise fashion, and it's counterclockwise. I think I had that backwards. You have to think about that for a minute. I think it's the other way around. I think the highs are going clockwise and the lows are going counterclockwise. But in any case, whether I'm right or wrong on that, with a high and a low positioned the way they are, they're both working to force between the two of them. They're working to force their air passage in one direction or another, depending on if I'm right or wrong on the clockwise and counterclockwise. If it is in fact counterclockwise for a high, then predominantly the winds are going to go this way around that high and this way around the low. So the combination of those two events taking place is forcing birds to move upward this way. If I have that wrong and it's the other way around, this was a good example for in the springtime, but this the other way around would be a good example for in the fall. The high would be going this way clockwise and the low is going counterclockwise. So they'd be driving, both of them would be driving winds down this way. And so again, if you have that positioned more over Illinois, you can see how that's directing the birds in a positive direction for their migration, whether they're in the spring or the fall. So we look for events like that happening, and the birds are actually aware of the winds, and so they know when to jump on for a ride. Obviously, a tailwind is much better for them than a headwind would be. Just like in our airplanes, it makes a lot more sense. And when you watch the airline schedules, you can see that a trip from Chicago to LA takes 4 hours going that way, and it's 3.5 hours going this way. So it's the same geographic plane. However, wind speeds and wind directions are coming into play. So all that is fine and dandy. And then you have other things that happen that come along with all those directional winds. And those would be various types of fronts that are going to cause some kind of a precipitation event or something. And so that would be something that would interrupt their migration. They are not going to fly in conditions where they have a lot of rain coming down, or if the winds do change and they are now fighting a severe headwind, they're not going to do that. They're going to try and avoid that as much as possible. And then there are all sorts of other things going on, like hurricanes and tropical storms. Once they're trying to get off of the continent in these regions here, those can cause havoc, huge havoc to their migration. So the migration is going to be timed. So if they are going to be taking off and flying in the night, it's usually happening a little after sunset, and it could be anywhere from 1 to several hours past sunset. But eventually, most of their flight is taking place overnight. As all of that rising air dissipates and we have all that turbulence dying down. And here my notes are saying 45 to 60 minutes after sunset, but I know that some of the birds will actually leave later than that. And the peak of all of that movement is probably around midnight, when most of the birds are in the air at any one particular time. And these are massive movements of birds. They are now picked up with some of our more sophisticated radar. We can actually pick up the fact that a whole bunch of birds, hundreds of thousands of birds or 1 million birds, have lifted off in one location and are now flying. Not necessarily wingtip to wingtip, but there's enough mass there in all those birds taking off that it can be distinguished on radar. So here's that incredible story I want to talk about. And this is in fact more about the fall migration than the spring migration, but I do want to at least impress upon you just the magic or the miracle of migration. So this is a Blackpool Warbler right here. This is what they look like in the fall. And this is a bird that's probably 4.5 to 5 inches long, somewhere probably closer to 4.5 inches long. And if you were to hold this bird in your hand, and to balance yourself, you would hold about 3 pennies in your other hand. So that's about all that this bird weighs. It's before migration, it probably weighs somewhere in the 9 to 10 grams range. And they do go through some hormonal changes. And so they start to put on some body weight before migration takes place. And they'll actually up their body weight in fat up to about 18 to 20 grams. So that's enough for them to start some of these incredible journeys. So this bird species does spend its time in South America. They do some island hopping and through Florida here to get to our region and beyond. So they're not actually staying here. They're actually breeding up here in Canada, but they are passing through our area, certainly. And these birds are coming up in the springtime, but in the fall, they're going to now take a little different path as they're heading south. And many of them, not exclusively, but many of them will actually gather up on the mid-Atlantic states here. And that's their jump off point. And when they leave there, and it is a true leap of faith, because when they leave here, they are now going to be out over open water until they make landfall in South America, in Venezuela. And that's just incredible. And this, again, has been tracked on radar. So it has been proven that this is actually taking place. And so estimates are that once these birds launch off and they make landfall finally here in Venezuela, they have been in the air between 72 and 80 hours. So I'd like you to think for just a minute about what you can do for 80 hours. We can't even sleep for 80 hours without medication. So, it's quite remarkable. And that whole time they're just flapping away. So you can see how critical it is that they have air that is not turbulent. You can see how important it is for them to have air that is cool. And obviously they're not going to run into too many predators out over the ocean. And so I don't know why that species came up with this migrational pattern, but it's obviously worked successfully for hundreds of thousands of years, because we still have Blackpool warblers. If it wasn't successful, this species would be dying out long ago, probably. Okay, so here I'm saying it's about 4 inches long. Their normal weight is about 10 grams. And in preparation, they do double their body weight. So this is just to verify that I was telling you a true story. Length of day affects the hypothalamus. That's what's going to trigger them to start storing fat. And that increase in their body weight takes about a 2-week period, and that's when they start their migration. So I think I covered all of that. So flying requires an incredible amount of energy, and that extra fat that's stored is there to satisfy the additional energy requirements. So sufficient fat storage minimizes the number of times that this bird has to stop on its path. And every time it stops on a path, it's going to be vulnerable to predators. And also it's vulnerable to the fact that it might have landed in an inhospitable place where there isn't a lot of food available. So all of that, could be big, huge problems. So they have to be very efficient in using that energy. And so studies, and I don't know how they do this to these poor little birds, but studies have shown that a small passerine such as the Blackpool Warbler will burn 0.08 of a gram of fat per hour when it's traveling about 27 miles per hour in favorable conditions. So they figured out that at that rate of consumption, that means the Blackpool Warbler jumping off from northeast in the United States and landing in the northeast of South America is flying 2,000 miles, and it's taking them approximately 80 hours. And they're burning a minimum of 6.4 grams of fat. So that's in favorable conditions. And so if they start running into problems, obviously some of these birds are going to perish. They're going to not be able to make the entire flight, and they're just going to end up in the ocean. And once they do hit the water, they're never coming back out. So it's quite remarkable that they're able to do this. So these birds have been happily doing all of these kinds of things over hundreds of thousands of years. And then we came along. And so at some point in time, because of the influences that we've had on the environment, the hazards will start to outweigh the benefits. And that's going to be a sad day. It's already happening. So in 1970, or since 1970, there's been a study that has been studying the bird populations in North America. And they've estimated that since 1970, we have lost approximately 3 billion birds from North America. That's the United States and Canada. And so these are just various conservation organizations or bird-related organizations that these are all headlines that are talking about the same study, and just they have found different ways to say it. But basically, we've lost a huge number of birds in a rather short time. And if you don't think that it's we're the culprits here for the most part. And if you don't think that that's possible, think a little bit about the passenger pigeon. That was a bird species that just that one species alone, they have estimated that bird species had a population of over 4 billion birds in North America. That's the only place it existed, was in North America, but 4 billion birds. And once we opened that bird up to commercial hunting for trade to all various parts of the world, they were killing these birds and shipping them all over the world, mostly Europe. But we managed to wipe that species off the face of the planet in a mere 40 years. So we are certainly capable of this kind of destruction. So the same thing is going on across a broad front as far as affecting all of the species in North America. And it is in fact affecting all of them, some more dramatically than others, but we are losing a lot of our birds. Just anecdotally from my own observations and watching or trying to find birds over the last 35 years. it was so much easier to find these birds in migration than it is now. Very, very difficult. So some of the grand things that are really obstacles that we have put in the way are tall buildings, certainly with lighting issues in the middle of the night, wind turbines, high towers, towers like this out on the coastlines, more buildings. So all of these things that we are introducing, we've introduced this over a rather short period of time. And birds can be very adaptive, but they can't adapt as quickly as we can put up new hazards. So we're outpacing them in that regard. So here's just one example. This was actually a collection of birds that were window strikes in, I think it was in Toronto. You can see this table is just covered with many, many birds and many different species. If you were to zoom this up a bit, you'd actually start to be able to identify some of these species. And there's all sorts of birds, not just songbirds, but I know one time I was looking at this, and I think this might be it right here. This is a woodcock, so it's a type of shorebird. So all sorts of things are crashing into the windows. And window strikes are a huge problem, and you can see why. And it's a reflection issue, and the birds don't recognize the fact that they're running into a pane of glass. And even when I worked downtown, at one time I had a imprint of a bird on my window. It looked somewhat like that. So this is the end result. We end up losing a lot of birds that way. So estimates are that we lose 100 million birds to window strikes every year. Every year. And what's even worse is that we have the same kind of thing going on with house cats. People let their cats out. We have a huge feral cat population now because of that. And so they estimate, and this is a conservative estimate, we're losing 100 million birds to cats every year. And vehicles is another 50 million. Electric transmission lines is over 100 million birds. Agriculture accounts with pesticides for about 65 million birds lost. Communication towers, another 4 million birds lost. And the list goes on and on. We have traffic fatality. I guess I do have vehicles up here. But I don't think I listed wind turbines. I don't have any data on that. But you can see that in all these ways, we're actually impacting, these birds. So as I mentioned, somewhere along the way, when either conditions aren't right or they've run as far as they're flown as far as they possibly can in the night, they're going to have to come down. So somewhere along the way, these birds do have to make a stop. And it's estimated that a 1,500-mile spring migration can take 20 to 40 days, depending on weather and other factors. So they're not flying every single day. If the conditions aren't right, they will sit tight. But in order to fly 1,500 miles, they are going to have to make several stops. And in doing so, every time they do, they have to wonder, where they're coming down and whether or not there'll be suitable conditions there for them to refuel. They do need to replenish those fat reserves every time they are coming down. And every time that they do come down, they're susceptible to predators. So there are a lot of issues with every time they have to come down. And birds are selective on where they'll search for a preferred habitat type and stop over. And how long they stay there depends on things like condition of the bird itself. When it landed, how much of a fuel reserve did it have? Was it almost totally exhausted, which means it probably has to stick around longer? Weather and wind direction will have an impact on whether or not they take off again. Availability of suitable place for them to land. So, let's say they land in the middle of that drought-stricken area in Texas. Well, they can't not stay there. So they are going to have to move on, even though they haven't replenished their fat reserves. But if they have a good quality habitat and good food supplies, they may stick around longer and totally recharge. So they're spending so much time en route between breeding grounds and wintering areas that the habitats that they depend on during that period have become very critical. And when we started to see bird species or bird numbers starting to decline, the first thing that we naturally tried to resolve was working on their breeding grounds. It made perfect sense to do that. And so a lot of time was focused, a lot of money was focused and energy on trying to make sure that we were preserving natural areas where they bred. And so we were still seeing birds declining. So then the next obvious thing was, well, let's deal with where they're wintering. That must be where we're losing all of our birds. And of course, that becomes more complicated because now you're crossing international borders, but there's really great conservation efforts in Central and South America. I've witnessed quite a few of them that are just super programs. So we're working on those problems as well, but we're still losing birds. So it has now become apparent that a lot of these birds, because they do have set routes that they run in order to make these migrations, along the way, they're very dependent on even small patches of ground. And that's where we're going next. That even small patch of the ground, like your own backyard, can be very, very important. So private landowners can contribute to the solution by providing appropriate trees and shrubs, maintaining wetlands if they have those on their property, and installing layered plantings, and using native plants. It's so critical to use the native plants, because you have to remember that all the things in nature have evolved over a very long period of time. And so they have these relationships. So insects have relationships with certain native plants. And so that's the plants they're looking for. And if they don't find those, the insects aren't successful. And if the insects aren't successful, our birds are not going to be successful, because out of that 268 species of birds that I mentioned, I think about 65% of them are insect eaters. And so if they're not finding insects in our backyard because we haven't planted native trees like oaks and elms and hawthorns and hickories and walnuts, if we haven't had the right shrubs in, like some of our viburnums, there's a whole list of various shrub species that would be beneficial. They're not only beneficial to the insects as pollinators, but also then to the birds. Allowing vegetation, dead vegetation, to stand over winter. We're always anxious to clean up our yards and make them look pretty spiffy, but if we leave all that stubble, that's where all the insects have laid their eggs for the next spring. They're in the stems of a lot of our plants. And so if we cut all that down and throw it all away, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Leaf litter is very important for ground foragers, and quite often I look out my window and I'll see, birds kind of flipping leaves in the backyard. My backyard is totally, almost totally native now, and so I don't rake up leaves very much at all. I leave most of that to overwinter, and the birds are really appreciative of that. And including a water supply all year round is another way that we can do that. So the basic needs for birds and for all of us is that we need food, water, and shelter. And in one form or another, all of these things probably exist in our backyards. So we can put up a birdhouse, we can put up a bird feeder, we can put up a bird bath. Check, check, and check, bring on the birds. But it's not quite that simple. As I mentioned, well, for one thing, cavity nesters, many of our birds are not cavity nesters. These are the most common birds that we'd expect to see in our backyards. I'm sure you've seen many of these in your own yards, but a very small number of these are actually cavity nesters. This is a cavity nester. Here's a red-bellied woodpecker, and here's downy woodpecker. So those would be cavity nesters. Actually, these three are also cavity nesters: black-capped chickadee and white-breasted nuthatch. And a house wren. So the representation I have up here is very disproportional to all of the 268 species of birds. But we seem to attract a lot of cavity nesters to our backyards because we do have bird houses and things like that. So in addition to the ones I have pictured here, there's a few other birds, but that's a list of 22 species basically out of the 268. So we have to do something more for them in order to attract some of those other species. So that those 22 species represent only 8% of the 268 species in DuPage County. And some species will never set foot in our backyard. So roughly 120 species, or 45%, require resources that are never going to be found in our backyards. And so I'm talking about some of our raptors that are migrating through, or the Sandhill crane, a lot of our waterfowl, things like that. We're never going to see those in our backyard. We'll never have the right habitat for that. But that still leaves 125 species, or 47% of the total, that might visit your yard if you have all the right resources. So here's some of the examples of some of the things we could attract to our yards. I've had all these in my backyard. Here we have yellow-billed cuckoo, and this is a ruby-throated hummingbird, yellow-bellied sapsucker, yellow-throated vireo, blue-headed vireo, golden-crowned kinglet, blue-gray gnatcatcher, winter wren, eastern towhee, gray catbird, white-crowned sparrow, and looks to be a house or a wood thrush. And some of the really slick birds that are coming through right now. This is when we're at the height of our spring migration. And we have things like ovenbird coming through, golden-winged warbler, black-throated green, hooded warbler, American redstart, chestnut-sided warbler, and many of these have shown up in my backyard. So pretty amazing the things that we can have in our yards if we make all the right changes. As I mentioned, a small percentage of our birds are cavity nesters, and so we need to do more than having that as a place of shelter. When we think of shelter, we think of our home, and a birdhouse has the word house in it, so we think of that as a home, but it really isn't. It's only used for the breeding season for the most part, and a small percentage of our birds are actually using birdhouses, so we have to think beyond that. So that landscaping with various layers that I briefly mentioned, that's what's going to give them, shelter in other forms. So we can create shelter without having that iconic birdhouse in our yard. Here's some examples of that. So you can see all the layering that's going on. You have different levels and depth to all of our gardens. So that would be crucial. This is a part of my backyard, and I don't have the luxury of having a deep yard where I can create a lot of depth in some of my areas, but I have naturalized everything. I don't have a lawn anymore. All of it is just native sedges and other woodland type plants. Like obviously have a very shady yard compared to most. So here's another angle on it. And so you can see that it's just all very naturalized, but it blends into the surrounding areas. So it can be done. So of those common species, 19 out of the 22 are seed eaters. Again, if we look at these numbers here, out of all those 125 birds that might visit our yard, 89 of them are insect eaters. So if we don't have the insects because we don't have the right plants, we're not going to have those birds. Talking about just making sure that we're planting native things here. And just to give you an example of just how great it is to have even plants that look like that they would not necessarily support pollinators. Let's hope that this launches. It has every other time. I guess I'll just have to tell you that a little hummingbird came flying in and actually visited every one of those little flowers on that Solomon's hill. So many of our yards look like this. This is a wasteland for producing insects, and I can't stress enough how important it is to have all those insects if you're going to have birds. So here's just a few examples of some of the insects. There's ways to go about looking for things on the internet, and you can find out which are the pollinator plants that you want. This actually goes all the way down to the Midwest region. So here's a listing of some of the plants. I'm kind of zipping through this just so that we have some Q&A time. And even, as far as not just the flowering plants, but also trees and shrubs, they're giving you many examples. So if you do some research, you can find that there's many, many species that are native that would benefit your backyard more so than any of those invasives. So public lands, the same thing is going on, and you can support a lot of those activities by volunteering. I do that all the time. That's what I spent most of my day today doing, was participating in various restoration events or doing monitoring in certain areas. So you can do all of that to help our birds out. So birds are not capable of evolving quickly enough to change with all the things that we're doing to them. And so it's important to keep that in mind. We can make more sensible choices with technology and architecture and landscaping and use of chemicals, and even keeping those pets indoors. So there's lots of things that we can do to create better habitats in our own backyards. And our backyards are critical for those long distance migrations. We might be a little postage stamp, but it might be just what that bird needs in order to make its next leg of the journey. So thanks for taking the time to attend the webinar, and hopefully I've given you some bird food for thought. And I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related, and where we can do that is actually on the DuPage Birding Club's education channel. So if you go to the DuPage Birding Club website, you'll see that there will be a link that'll take you to the education channel. And currently I think we have 74 tutorials out there on all sorts of bird related topics. So there's a wealth of knowledge out there. It's all thanks to COVID. We couldn't have meetings or field trips during a portion of our last couple of years. And so while we wanted to give something to our membership, we decided to open up an education channel, and all of that is out there now for you. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point. And if we have some questions that we can get into, or if I can help anybody out to help us save the planet, I'd be more than willing to do that.
Thank you so much, Denis. Yeah, there are a couple of questions that we'll address in just a second. I will remind people, if you'd have a question for Denis, go ahead and open up that Q&A. That should be an icon along the bottom edge of your screen or in your settings, and put your question in there. And also, Denis, you mentioned native plants and natural areas. We have had a couple of programs just recently on those topics. So in my follow-up email tonight, as well as the website for the DuPage Birding Club, I'll put links to some of those other resources for people. So let's get to the questions. Someone is asking, will you just speak a little bit about avian flu? Because they've heard maybe mixed information regarding bird baths and feeders, and maybe how it is propagating the avian flu.
Gee, I don't know how I imagined that this would come up tonight. So there is a lot of, it is hard to understand exactly what to do. We hear a lot of reports saying take everything down, and at the same time we're also hearing reports saying, well, the avian flu is mostly concentrated in our waterfowl and in raptors. So they're suggesting that perhaps it wouldn't have much impact on our songbirds, which is what we're mostly feeding in our backyards. Some of us will feed hummingbirds in our backyards as well. So I've mentioned that we've lost 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. And if you're confused at all, we should err on the side of doing things that would not be detrimental to those birds. So whether or not you're seeing those mixed signals on whether or not you can still feed your songbirds, my recommendation would be to pull those feeders down. Birds that are migrating through are going to, take advantage of our feeders because it's a pretty easy meal, but they're also capable of finding food on their own. In fact, most birds probably visit feeders and to get their energy replenished, probably no more than 25%. The rest of the time, they're actually out foraging and finding legitimate food, I'll call it that. But at any rate, they're going to survive whether we have feeders or not. So rather than take the risk, I would say follow the rules that are saying take the feeders down. I don't typically feed birds in my yard with a feeder. I've gone the route of trying to naturalize everything, so I very seldom will have a feeder going other than hummingbird feeders, just because that happens to be my favorite family of birds.
Okay, thank you. So kind of getting into some of those plants that we can provide, someone is asking which backyard bird species are nectar feeders?
Well, certainly that ruby-throated hummingbird that videos that wouldn't run. I don't know why it didn't do that, because I've done this 100 times and it always seems to run. But ruby-throated hummingbird would be the main bird nectivore that we would have. However, we do have at least one other that I can think of, and that's surprisingly the Cape May Warbler. And most of our warblers are insect eaters, and the Cape May is as well, but they have a slightly decurved bill. And I actually have pictures. In fact, one of the pictures that was in the tutorial or the presentation I just did, there was a Cape May Warbler in there, and it was actually visiting flowers on a gooseberry, and it was actually getting nectar from that. So it's a well documented case of an insectivore that also goes for nectar. Another bird group that probably goes for nectar at some point in time, although I don't necessarily see it down here or here in the States, but that would be our Orioles, because they will also come to feeders for nectar. When we put up a hummingbird feeder, it's not surprising to get a Baltimore Oriole coming to a hummingbird feeder and stealing some sugar water. So obviously they're going after nectar as well. And then beyond that food source of nectar, some birds will actually go after the sap in a wound on a tree. So that's nearly the same kind of a thing going on. So they are getting energy from wounds on a tree. I've seen some of our migrating warblers that are migrating late in the year, and the conditions are maybe such that it's very cold out and there aren't a lot of insects around. And I have seen various warbler species go up into a tree that has a wound on the bark, and they'll be sucking sap out of there. They'll visit sap wells on yellow-bellied sapsuckers. Will actually create sap wells, and other birds will visit those sap wells to get the sap just besides the yellow-bellied sapsucker. The ruby-throated hummingbirds do that, and I'm sure other birds do as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So we were talking about native plants a little bit, and someone is asking, are sedges useful for a bird habitat? Is that what
They,
you?
I have thousands of dollars worth of sedges in my backyard, so I hope so. I probably have over 20 species of sedges in my yard. Some of those are actually, if you go to the state's list of plants that are great for pollinators and great for birds, you'll actually notice that one sedge in particular, it's called Carex muskingamensis, which is the palm sedge, and they actually list that as a species that's beneficial. But I certainly see some of the sedges that have larger seeds. The birds will be foraging for those. As I said, I leave that leaf layer, so they'll be flipping leaves all winter long, and they're looking for little seeds that are down there. And some of the seeds are rather substantial. One of the caryxes I have in my yard is Carex greatii, and it gets like a big club shaped, about that size, head on it, and that's a collection of all the little seeds. It looks like a spiny ping pong ball almost, and each of those capsules in that creates that whole ball. They each have a seed inside, so they're going after those for sure.
Okay, thank you. And as we're talking about various species of trees and your sedges and such, someone's asking, do you know of like an arborist who has experience making snags of dead trees? I think they're trying to create a habitat that way.
Yeah, I don't know of anyone specifically that will do that. However, when I was manager of natural areas for St. Charles Park District, when we had to take a tree out because it was a hazard near a trail or near a boundary, I would often ask if they could cut it, 12 feet up or something like that. And, depending on the arborist, they would do it. So it's not a difficult task for them to do. They're already probably up in the tree climbing around like little monkeys anyway, something I don't do. But if they're up there with their harnesses and everything, they can get that tree cut at whatever level you want, most likely, because they're probably already up there doing that anyway, taking out limbs one at a time. If it's near an area, near a house or something like that, they have to pretty much do that. So it's certainly doable. I would just ask them about it, whoever you're using.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Okay, we've got a couple questions about specific species of birds. Someone's saying, have robins always been around year-round residents, or have human influences caused the robins to be more year-round?
Yes. um, I think that our landscaping influences probably make them more noticeable. So now, because of the things we're planting, we have fruiting trees in our yard a lot. And so those fruits and berries that hang around, those are going to attract the robins to our backyards. And sometimes it's things you wouldn't even think about. I have a hackberry in the front of my house, and so that produces little seeds. And I had this winter, probably in late January or early February, I probably had a swarm of 50 robins in that tree, and also another 50 starlings, and they were all competing and grabbing every little seed that was left on that tree. So we certainly influence, and thus we see the birds in our neighborhoods more, but probably along those riverways, those lowland areas where we did have a lot of fruiting trees already. That's where quite often we would run into robins. We've been doing spring counts or Christmas counts in the area since late 1970s. And in that data, there's always been robins, and that count is it's not done on Christmas. It's actually done in a 3-week window that starts on December 14th and runs for 3 weeks. So a Christmas count can occur anywhere in that window. The one at Fermilab happens to be always the first Saturday in the window. So that means it's anywhere from the 18th to the 14th to the 20th. So within that window right there, we've always had robins on our list.
Okay. And so we do have a couple questions asking you to identify birds. So hopefully we've got enough information here. Someone says, about a month ago, I saw a large swarm of black birds fly by this right near downtown. They landed on a telephone or light pole, sat there for a while, and then flew away in formation. Any guesses what that bird was.
Yeah, guessing just because of the fact that they were going up on the wires and all that, they're probably European starlings. So that's a non-native species, and they frequently will be seen on electric lines and light poles and things like that. So, just to guess without having any other details.
Right. Yeah.
So you'll have to watch some of my videos to figure out some of these species. But there's a lot of them out there.
Yes, yes, the wonderful resources there. We're just trying to stump you tonight here a little bit.
Okay, that's all right.
So, and again, another identification question. This person says, when they wake up in the morning, a red-breasted bird sits on the very small tree right outside the window, and they're wondering if maybe it's a robin, and if they'll see more of them as the weather warms.
Well, until we determine the species, I really can't answer that one. So some of the birds that have red on them, obviously robins have kind of a rusty red breast. There's another bird that's much smaller, and it's the house finch, and that has a red breast as well. Um, the robin is in the thrush family, actually, and so they have kind of a fluty musical song. So if you're hearing something that seems kind of musical, chances are that's that robin. The house finch would be more chattery, and it's small. It's actually smaller than our house sparrows, which I'm sure everybody's kind of familiar with house sparrows. Obviously, the robin would be probably body mass. It's probably at least double the size of the, probably even more than that, than the house sparrow. So without any greater details, it's kind of hard for me to tell you what that one was.
Right, right. And we've mentioned there are so many great resources
Mhm.
on that website, and we'll be
Yeah,
providing
and
those.
268 species that show up in the county, so we can narrow it down a little bit. But
Amazing, amazing. All right. And then the last question here just kind of circles back to that illness caused by the bird baths, and to confirm, is it better to remove those bird baths, or have some of those issues been resolved? They're asking.
it's anything that's going to cause the birds to concentrate in an area. So the feeders, we addressed that, and I failed to say anything about the bird baths. But yeah, I've tipped all my bird baths on their side, so they won't hold any water. It's not likely that most of us have waterfowl in our backyard, which seems to be the group of birds that's the major vector for this. But if you do have ducks, if you do have bird feeders and even a bird bath, it's surprising the ducks show up. And I do have a couple of mallards every spring. They come waddling through the yard, and I've already seen them this year too. And they don't nest in my backyard, but they usually find somebody's evergreen and they nest underneath there. So they're not nesting near water, but they do come and visit my bird bath, and they plop themselves in there and take a bath.
Okay, all right. Well, it looks like that's all of our questions for tonight. Someone did give the pointer that we're at one point you were talking about lows and highs at the
Oh
season.
yeah, I had that in the back of my head, just all mixed up. I don't know why.
And someone here is giving us the advice that lows always go to the left or counterclockwise. You
Okay.
can sort of remember lows with left. So if
Okay.
that would be a great tip if that.
Yeah, so I did have it backwards, and I was thinking as I was saying it, it just didn't sound right, and so that's why I just punted and said it both ways.
No
But thank you.
problem.
Obviously, we have a meteorologist out there in the crowd
There we
tonight,
go.
so
Say
I appreciate that.
we're all helping each other out here.
Exactly.
So, well, that does look like that's all of our questions. So thank you so much for that great presentation, all that wonderful information. As we've mentioned a couple of times, that we're going to send out the link to the DuPage Birding Club's website, as well as some other resources, links to those other programs that I mentioned about native plants and natural areas restoration that was provided by the DuPage Forest Preserve just a week or so ago. So we'll provide all that great information to you. If you happen to be watching the recording of this program and would like those links, please just email me at ce@wheatonlibrary.org. That's CE for community engagement at wheatonlibrary.org, and I'd be happy to send those out to you. So again, thank you so much to everyone who attended tonight, and thank you, Dennis. This was wonderful.
Yeah,
And
we did pretty well. It's only 8:05, so
exactly. That's great. So good night, everybody. Take care, and we hope to see you again soon.